Ethan Collins had always yearned for tranquility in a world that seemed progressively tumultuous. At 45, he finally managed to acquire his dream estate, a spacious, peaceful expanse situated on the fringes of a serene countryside village. The locale was encircled by majestic trees, gentle hills, and an aura of calm that felt exceedingly precious. For years, Ethan had been diligently saving for this refuge, envisioning it as a place to dedicate himself to his academic pursuits and escape the clamor of urban existence. He pictured this residence as his personal sanctuary, a haven to rejuvenate, contemplate, and live in peace. However, life, as he would soon discover, had different intentions. The initial indication of trouble emerged merely weeks after Ethan had settled in. One crisp Saturday afternoon, after completing errands in the nearby town, he returned to find numerous vehicles parked along his driveway. Some were nestled into the gravel path leading up to his home, while others had spilled onto the grassy area adjacent to his fence. The sight immediately struck him as peculiar. He was unfamiliar with any of the cars, and his closest neighbors resided sufficiently distant to have no reason to trespass on his property. Assuming it was a simple misunderstanding, he exited his vehicle to inspect more closely. As Ethan approached the scene, his confusion morphed into frustration. A small wooden placard had been affixed to one of the trees near his property boundary. It read, "Overflow Parking Community Access Encouraged." The hand-painted letters, slightly askew, suggested a hastily assembled sign, as if someone had put it together without much consideration. However, it wasn't the amateurish craftsmanship that unsettled him, but the message itself. Community access? Ethan had not consented to anything of that nature, and the notion that someone had unilaterally decided to utilize his land without authorization felt like an intrusion. Ethan made his way to the nearest residence, a modest two-story house owned by his neighbor, Marcus Bennett. Marcus, a man in his early 50s with a friendly disposition, welcomed him at the door with a broad smile. "Ethan, great to see you," Marcus greeted warmly, as if they were longtime friends. Ethan wasted no time. "Marcus, do you know anything about the cars parked on my property? There's also a sign about community parking. Did you put that up?" Marcus's smile remained steady, but there was a hint of something behind his eyes, perhaps amusement or indifference. "Ah, yes," Marcus replied, leaning casually against the doorway. "I thought you wouldn't mind. We've had some local events lately. Fundraisers, small gatherings, that sort of thing. And parking has always been a challenge. Your lot is so roomy and conveniently located by the main road. Perfect for overflow parking." Ethan felt his jaw tighten. Perfect for overflow parking. "Marcus, with all due respect, this is my property. You didn't think to ask me first?" Marcus shrugged, as though Ethan had brought up something trivial. "I didn't think it'd be a big deal. It's just for the community, you know. People park, they leave, no harm done. Besides, it's a way to give back to the neighborhood." Ethan took a deep breath, striving to keep his temper under control. "I appreciate the intention, but this isn't a public lot. I don't want people parking on my land. Please inform them they need to remove their cars." Marcus's expression shifted ever so slightly. The warmth in his smile faded, replaced by a more calculated look. "I understand where you're coming from, Ethan, but this isn't just about you. This area has always been about community support. The previous owner didn't have an issue with it. People here help each other out." "That may be," Ethan responded firmly, "but I'm not the previous owner. This is my land now, and I'm asking you to respect that." Marcus raised his hands in mock surrender. All right, no need to get heated. I'll let them know." Though Marcus seemed satisfied, Ethan still felt uneasy. He returned to his home, and by the next morning, the cars had disappeared and the sign had been removed. He allowed himself to believe the matter was settled. Yet, something about Marcus's demeanor didn't sit right with him. There was an edge to his tone, a subtle defiance that made Ethan suspect the issue wasn't truly resolved. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, the vehicles returned, this time in greater numbers. Ethan came home to find not only cars on his grass and driveway, but also a new, larger sign nailed to a tree. Overflow parking supported by local residents. This one was more robust, with bold, blocky letters in vibrant colors. To exacerbate matters, someone had arranged folding chairs and a makeshift table near his property's entrance, as if to formalize it into an official parking area. Ethan didn't visit Marcus's house this time. Instead, he called him directly. The phone rang 3 times before Marcus answered. "Hey there, Ethan." "Marcus," Ethan began, his frustration evident. "We talked about this. Why are there cars on my property again?" "Oh, come on, Ethan," Marcus replied, his tone light but tinged with annoyance. "It's not like you're using that space. It's just grass. Besides, people are starting to expect it now. You wouldn't want to upset the neighborhood, would you?" Ethan clenched his teeth. "This isn't up for discussion. Remove them from my land or I'll have them towed." There was a pause before Marcus chuckled. "Well, you could try that, but some folks might not take too kindly to that approach. Just saying." Marcus's words felt like a veiled threat, but Ethan stood his ground. "I'm serious, Marcus. This ends now." The call ended abruptly, leaving Ethan fuming. It was clear Marcus wasn't taking him seriously, and as days passed, the situation only worsened. More cars appeared, some even blocking the path to his house. One morning, Ethan found a flyer in his mailbox advertising free community parking courtesy of his neighbor, Marcus. It felt like an intentional provocation, a message that Marcus was daring him to escalate the conflict. Ethan knew he had to act decisively. This was no longer merely about parking. It was about safeguarding his rights and establishing boundaries. He couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus's attitude was indicative of more significant issues. The cars had become more than a nuisance. They were a genuine problem. One morning, Ethan awoke to the sound of tires crunching over gravel, the unmistakable noise of multiple vehicles maneuvering near his house. He looked out the window and felt a knot form in his stomach. A dozen cars were haphazardly parked across his lawn and driveway. Some were perilously close to his flower beds, and a large SUV had been backed so far into his property that its rear tires had crushed a newly reseeded patch of grass. It was worse than before. Not only were there more vehicles, but the parking area now had an almost intentional layout. Someone had placed orange traffic cones to create lanes, and fresh tire marks crisscrossed his lawn as though it had been transformed into a public lot. Near the driveway's edge stood a new sign firmly planted in the ground. Overflow Parking Community Initiative. Thank you for supporting local events. Ethan felt his blood boil. This wasn't just inconsiderate. It was a blatant overreach. He stormed out the door, his pulse racing, and immediately sought Marcus. The man was nowhere to be found, but Ethan noticed a few people lingering near their parked cars. A woman in a floral sundress was unloading folding chairs from her sedan, while a man in a baseball cap was directing another car with exaggerated arm movements, as if he were a valet. The surreal scene hit Ethan like a slap in the face. "Excuse me," he called out, striding toward the man in the baseball cap. The man glanced at him briefly before resuming his duties. "Hey, Ethan," his voice rose. "What do you think you're doing on my property?" The man stopped and gave him an indignant look. "I'm just helping with the parking. Marcus told us it was fine. He said you were okay with this." Ethan's fists clenched. Marcus lied. This is private property, and I didn't agree to any of this. I want all these cars removed now. The man gave a half-hearted shrug and mumbled something under his breath before returning to his task. Furious, Ethan turned to the woman with the folding chairs. "Did Marcus tell you this was okay too?" She looked up, startled, and offered an apologetic smile. "Oh, I thought this was part of the community event. Marcus said it was for the neighborhood and that you were allowing us to use the space." "Well, I'm not Ethan Collins," he snapped. "This is my land. I don't care what Marcus told you. Pack up your things and leave." The woman hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but nodded and began folding the chairs back into her trunk. As Ethan moved to confront the others, he heard someone call out behind him. "Ethan?" There was no need for a confrontation. It was Marcus, jogging toward him with a bright, infuriating grin plastered on his face. He wore a casual polo shirt and jeans, embodying the friendly neighborhood organizer persona. "What is this?" Ethan demanded, gesturing to the chaos on his lawn. "I told you no parking on my property. You've crossed the line." "Relax," Marcus replied, holding up his hands as if to calm a skittish animal. "This is just a temporary arrangement. We've got a big community event happening down the street, and parking's always a hassle. I figured this was a win-win. You weren't using the space, and we needed it. No harm, no foul." "No harm," Ethan's voice rose. "Look at my lawn. Look at the mess. You've turned my property into a circus without my permission." Marcus's smile didn't falter, but his tone sharpened. "Come on, Ethan. It's just grass. It'll grow back. You're making a big deal out of nothing." Ethan stared at him, incredulous. "This isn't up for discussion. I want them gone. Now." "This isn't up for discussion. I want them gone. Now," Ethan repeated, his frustration evident. Marcus's expression hardened. "I'm trying to do something good for the community. People here support each other. Maybe you should try it sometime instead of being so territorial." "This isn't about community," Ethan shot back. "This is about you using my property as if it's yours. You're not helping anyone. You're just being selfish." Marcus's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the facade of friendliness slipped. "Selfish? That's rich coming from you. All you've done since moving here is complain and shut people out. Do you think anyone in this neighborhood appreciates that kind of attitude?" "I don't care what they think," Ethan responded coldly. "This is my land, and you have no right to use it. Remove the cars from my property or I'll have every one of them towed." Marcus's lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. "You can try," he said, his voice low. "But good luck explaining that to everyone when they start asking why you're being such a tyrant. Do you think people are going to side with you over me? Think again." The implied threat hung heavily in the air. Ethan didn't respond. He turned on his heel and marched back to his house, slamming the door behind him. His hands trembled with anger as he dialed the local towing company. When the dispatcher answered, Ethan explained the situation and requested immediate assistance. The dispatcher paused. "You're saying there are vehicles trespassing on your property?" "That's correct," Ethan said through gritted teeth. "All right, we can send someone out, but you'll need to be there to authorize the removal. And just so you know, if any of the owners file complaints, it could turn into a legal matter. Are you prepared for that?" Ethan hesitated. The thought of escalating the situation further was daunting, but he wasn't about to let Marcus walk all over him. "Yes," he said firmly. "Send them." By the time the tow truck arrived, most of the cars were still there, though a few people had left after noticing Ethan's anger. The driver, a burly man in his late 40s, gave Ethan a sympathetic nod as he surveyed the scene. "This looks like a mess," the driver said. "You sure you want me to start towing? People can get pretty heated about their cars." "Do it," Ethan replied. "They're trespassing." As the driver began his work, a crowd started to gather. Marcus was among them, watching the proceedings with a mixture of amusement and disdain. A few car owners rushed forward, shouting protests and demanding explanations. Ethan stood his ground, repeating the same phrase over and over. "This is private property. Take it up with Marcus." Eventually, the lot was cleared, but the tension in the air was palpable. Marcus didn't speak to Ethan that day, but the smug look on his face as he walked away left no doubt in Ethan's mind that the conflict wasn't over. That evening, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, gazing out the window at his battered lawn. He felt a deep sense of unease, as though he had provoked a slumbering beast. Marcus wasn't the type to back down, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this confrontation was merely the beginning of something much larger. The following morning, Ethan woke to an ominous silence outside. For the first time in weeks, his property was free of cars, and the chaotic clutter of folding chairs, cones, and makeshift parking signs had been removed. It was as if the previous day's events had never occurred. However, his lawn told a different story. Deep tire ruts, scattered trash, and flattened patches of grass were glaring reminders of what he had endured. The sight made his stomach churn, but the silence unsettled him even more. He spent the morning cleaning up the remnants of the unauthorized parking lot. Empty plastic bottles, crumpled flyers, and even a lost shoe littered his property. As he worked, he kept glancing toward the road, half expecting Marcus or one of his so-called community members to reappear. But no one came. The quiet felt unnatural, like the calm before a storm. Later that afternoon, Ethan decided it was time to establish firm boundaries. He drove into town and purchased heavy-duty wooden stakes, reflective tape, and a sign that clearly read, "Private property, no parking. Violators will be towed." Back home, he hammered the stakes into the ground along the driveway's edge and ran the tape between them to create a makeshift barrier. He placed the sign at the entrance, ensuring it was impossible to miss. The message was clear. His land was off-limits. By the time he finished, the sun was setting. Satisfied with his efforts, Ethan retreated indoors and made himself a cup of coffee. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of relief. He had taken action, set boundaries, and made it clear that he wouldn't tolerate further intrusions. If Marcus or anyone else dared to cross the line again, they'd face immediate consequences. However, the relief was short-lived. The following morning, Ethan stepped outside to find his newly erected barrier in ruins. The stakes had been ripped from the ground, the tape shredded and discarded like refuse. The private property sign was missing altogether. In its place stood a new sign, larger and more professional-looking, mounted on sturdy metal poles. Community parking zone. Respect the environment and each other. Ethan felt his blood pressure surge as he stared at the sign in disbelief. He knew immediately who was responsible. Marcus. It had to be Marcus. The man was relentless, and this latest act was nothing short of a declaration of war. Determined to confront him, Ethan marched over to Marcus's house. He pounded on the door with more force than intended, his frustration boiling over. Marcus opened the door, his expression one of practiced innocence. "Good morning, Ethan," he greeted, smiling as though nothing was wrong. "What brings you by?" "Don't play dumb," Ethan snapped. "What the hell is that sign doing on my property? And what gives you the right to tear down my barriers?" Marcus's smile faded, replaced by a look of feigned exasperation. "Oh, that? Look, Ethan, I didn't touch your little setup, but the community felt it wasn't very welcoming. People were getting confused, and I figured a proper sign would help clarify things. You don't want people to think you're hostile, do you?" Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. "You're unbelievable. This is my land, Marcus. Mine. I don't care what the community thinks, and I certainly didn't ask for your input. That sign is being taken down today." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his tone turning colder. "I wouldn't recommend that, Ethan. You might upset a lot of people, and trust me, you don't want to get on the community's bad side. We look out for each other here. Maybe it's time you started doing the same?" "Don't threaten me," Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with anger. "If you want to fight, you'll get one, but you won't win." Marcus smirked. "We'll see about that." Ethan turned on his heel and stormed back to his house, his heart pounding in his chest. The sheer audacity of Marcus's behavior was almost too much to bear. How could someone be so brazen, so arrogant? It wasn't just disrespectful, it was malicious. Back at home, Ethan called his lawyer and explained the situation. The lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Laura, listened carefully before offering her advice. "Ethan, you have every right to protect your property, but this situation is escalating. It sounds like your neighbor is trying to intimidate you into backing down. I recommend filing a formal complaint with the local authorities and documenting everything. Photos, videos, written records. Gather as much evidence as you can." Ethan thanked her and hung up, feeling a renewed sense of determination. If Marcus wanted a war, Ethan would fight it the right way through the system. He grabbed his phone and went outside, snapping pictures of the sign, the torn-up stakes, and the damaged lawn. He also began keeping a detailed journal, noting every interaction and incident with Marcus. That evening, as he reviewed the photos, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from an unknown sender with the subject line, "Concerned Neighbor." Intrigued, Ethan opened it. The message was brief but chilling. "Watch your back. Marcus doesn't like to lose." Ethan stared at the screen, his pulse quickening. The email address was anonymous, and there was no way to trace the sender. Was this a genuine warning, or just another tactic to intimidate him? Either way, it only strengthened his resolve. The next day, Ethan filed a report with the local sheriff's office detailing the ongoing harassment and trespassing. The deputy who took his statement seemed sympathetic but non-committal. "We'll look into it," he said, which Ethan knew was code for not expecting much. Still, it was a step forward and provided a paper trail in case things escalated further. And escalate they did. That weekend, Ethan woke up to find his driveway completely blocked by parked cars. There were no events happening nearby, no excuse for the vehicles to be there. It was a deliberate act of defiance. Furious, Ethan called the towing company, but when the trucks arrived, they were met with resistance. A group of people led by Marcus had gathered near the entrance to Ethan's property, shouting and waving signs that read, "Stop the tyranny," and "Community first." The scene descended into chaos. Some of the car owners began yelling at the tow truck drivers, accusing Ethan of being a bully. Marcus, ever the opportunist, played the role of the victim, loudly proclaiming that Ethan was tearing apart the neighborhood with his selfishness. Ethan remained steadfast, standing on his porch with his arms crossed as the trucks removed car after car. But the damage was done. The crowd dispersed eventually, but not before making it clear that Ethan was now the neighborhood pariah. As he stood alone on his battered lawn, Ethan felt a mix of anger and exhaustion. Marcus wasn't just a nuisance. He was a master manipulator, capable of rallying others to his cause and turning the community against him. This wasn't just a dispute over land anymore. It was a struggle for control, and Ethan knew he had to dig deep to prevail. Allowing things to escalate further wasn't an option. Marcus had moved beyond simple provocation. This was now a coordinated effort to undermine Ethan's property rights and his standing in the neighborhood. It wasn't merely about the cars anymore. It was about control, power, and Marcus's determination to impose his will regardless of the consequences. For Ethan, it was time to change strategies. He wasn't going to let Marcus continue dictating the terms of this battle. The day after the driveway blockade incident, Ethan decided to dig deeper. He contacted Laura, his lawyer, for a strategy session. Her advice was blunt but effective. If Marcus is trying to involve the community, you need to present the facts. You need proof of your ownership, documentation of the damage, and clarity on the legality of what's happening. Public opinion is something Marcus clearly values. "Let's see how much he enjoys it when the truth is on full display," Laura suggested. She recommended starting with property records. Ethan visited the county registrar's office to obtain every document related to his land. He meticulously reviewed the records, confirming once again that his property encompassed the area Marcus was claiming as community parking. There were no easements, no shared ownership agreements, no loopholes. The land was entirely his. He also discovered something intriguing: a series of permit applications submitted by Marcus over the past few years. Most were for minor projects like tree trimming and fence repairs, but one recent application caught his attention. It was a proposal for a community development project to establish overflow parking on an adjacent lot that Marcus did not own but had hoped to lease. The application had been denied due to zoning restrictions. It was a critical detail, one that exposed Marcus's ongoing attempts to exploit nearby properties for his personal agenda. Armed with this information, Ethan returned home and began organizing everything into a comprehensive folder. He included copies of his deed, the zoning denial for Marcus's project, photos of the damage to his lawn, and a timeline of the harassment. Laura assured him that this was the right approach. "If it comes to a legal fight, this documentation will be our foundation. But more importantly, it's leverage. If you present this to the right people, the local authorities, even your neighbors, it could start to turn the tide." Meanwhile, Marcus continued his campaign. Flyers were distributed around the neighborhood accusing Ethan of being anti-community and hostile to progress. One flyer featured a photo of Ethan's property with the caption, wasted space that could serve the community. The insinuation was clear. Marcus was portraying Ethan as the villain, the selfish outsider unwilling to contribute. The situation escalated further when Ethan noticed new tire tracks on his lawn one morning. This time, someone had deliberately driven in circles, tearing up the grass and creating wide arcs. It was an act of pure vandalism, and it left him seething. He reported the incident to the sheriff's office, but as usual, their response was lukewarm. "We'll send someone to take a look," the deputy said, though Ethan doubted it would lead to anything substantial. That evening, Ethan installed motion-activated floodlights around his property's perimeter. He also set up new security cameras, ensuring they were positioned high enough to be out of reach. If Marcus or his supporters attempted anything else, Ethan would have hard evidence. The turning point came a few days later when Ethan received an unexpected knock at his door. It was an older neighbor, a man named Harold, who had lived in the area for decades. Harold seemed hesitant at first, but after some encouragement, he revealed that he was fed up with Marcus's antics. "Marcus has been pulling these kinds of stunts for years," Harold said, shaking his head. "He gets people on his side by pretending he's doing things for the community, but it's all about him. A few years back, he tried to turn a vacant lot into a storage yard for his business. He told everyone it was a shared resource, but it was just for his personal gain. When people caught on, he backed off, but not before making life miserable for the lot's owner." Harold offered to support Ethan if the situation went public. "You're not the first person he's targeted, and you won't be the last. I don't agree with how he's treating you, and I know a few others who feel the same way." Encouraged by Harold's words, Ethan decided it was time to take his case directly to the neighborhood. He arranged a meeting with several other residents, presenting his folder of evidence and laying out the facts. The meeting was tense at first. Marcus's influence was evident in the skeptical expressions of some attendees. However, as Ethan spoke, the mood began to shift. He showed them the property records proving his ownership, the photos of the damage, and the zoning denial for Marcus's parking project. "This isn't about me being selfish or uncooperative," Ethan said firmly. "This is about someone who's willing to trample on others' rights to get what he wants. If it can happen to me, it can happen to any of you." By the end of the meeting, several neighbors voiced their support. Some admitted they had felt pressured to go along with Marcus's schemes out of fear of being ostracized. Others simply hadn't realized the extent of his manipulation. It wasn't a complete victory. Marcus still had loyalists, but it was a start. The next day, Ethan took his documentation to the local zoning board, filing a formal complaint against Marcus for his repeated encroachments and unauthorized actions. The board agreed to review the case, though they warned that the process could take weeks. Still, it was progress. But Marcus wasn't finished. That same evening, Ethan noticed a group of people gathered near his property's edge. They were whispering among themselves, gesturing toward his house, and holding what appeared to be tools. When he stepped outside to confront them, they scattered into the shadows. It was a chilling reminder that Marcus's influence extended beyond words. He had people willing to act on his behalf. Ethan decided to take a calculated risk. He reached out to a local journalist who occasionally covered disputes and issues within the community. Without naming names, he described the situation and provided some of his evidence. The journalist agreed to investigate, intrigued by the possibility of uncovering a larger story about neighborhood politics and abuse of power. By the end of the week, the tension had reached a boiling point. Marcus showed up uninvited at Ethan's property, flanked by a few of his supporters. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Marcus said, his voice low and menacing. "All of this could have been avoided if you'd just played along. Do you really think anyone's going to side with you in the long run?" Ethan didn't flinch. "I don't care about your games, Marcus. I care about my rights. And trust me, people are starting to see through you." Marcus's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might lash out. But then he smiled, a cold, calculated smile that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. "All right," Marcus said softly. "Have it your way, but don't say I didn't warn you." As Marcus walked away, Ethan felt a mix of triumph and dread. He had made significant progress, but he knew the fight was far from over. Marcus wasn't the type to back down quietly, and the stakes were only getting higher. Ethan braced himself for whatever came next, determined to see this battle through to the end. Ethan had prepared himself for escalation, but nothing could have truly readied him for what happened next. The calm after Marcus's veiled threat didn't last long. Within days, the situation took a darker turn, pushing Ethan further into the battle for his property and forcing him to adopt measures he never thought he'd need. It started with a letter. Early one morning, as Ethan was heading out to check his mailbox, he noticed a large envelope protruding. The logo of the local planning committee was emblazoned on the corner, making his stomach tighten. Opening it, he quickly scanned the contents, and his fears were confirmed. The letter was a formal notice regarding a community request to rezone a portion of his land that Marcus had turned into a parking area. Attached was a petition allegedly signed by several neighbors, claiming the land was better suited for community purposes. The sheer audacity of it made Ethan's hands tremble with frustration. Rezoning? For his land? It was another blatant attempt by Marcus to undermine him, now using the legal system as a weapon. Ethan could practically see Marcus sitting smugly in his house, confident that bureaucracy would wear him down. The letter gave him 14 days to respond. Ethan called Laura immediately, and her response was sharp and to the point. "They're testing you. Don't let them win. File a formal objection and prepare for a public hearing. This will buy us time to strategize." Ethan spent the next 2 days working with Laura to draft a detailed objection, citing his property rights, the lack of legitimate community need, and the fabricated nature of the petition. He also contacted Harold and a few other supportive neighbors, asking if they had been approached about signing the petition. To his surprise, most of them had never even seen it. It was becoming increasingly clear that Marcus was either pressuring people into signing or outright forging names. However, the situation continued to escalate, so a few nights after receiving the letter, Ethan woke to the sound of heavy machinery outside. Disoriented, he grabbed a flashlight and looked out the window. His heart sank. At the edge of his property, someone had brought in a small bulldozer and was clearing the grass where the parking signs had been placed. The floodlights Ethan had installed illuminated the scene, revealing 2 men in high-visibility vests operating the machine. Furious, Ethan stormed outside and shouted at them to stop. The men froze momentarily, startled, but then one of them calmly replied, "We're here on behalf of the neighborhood committee. This area is being prepped for improved parking access. It's already been approved." "Approved by who?" Ethan yelled, his voice carrying over the sound of the machine's rumbling engine. "This is private property. You have no right to be here." The men exchanged a glance. Then one of them shrugged and climbed back into the bulldozer. "Take it up with the committee," he said dismissively as the machine roared to life again. Ethan ran back into his house and dialed the sheriff's office, his hands shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. When the deputy arrived 20 minutes later, the men had already fled, leaving a trail of torn-up grass and disturbed soil behind them. Ethan explained the situation, showing the deputy his property documents and the ongoing harassment he'd been dealing with. The deputy took notes but offered little reassurance. "I'll file a report," he said, "but this sounds like a civil matter. You'll probably need to handle it through the courts." As the deputy drove away, Ethan stood in the cool night air, staring at the damage. The sense of violation was overwhelming. They were no longer just parking on his land. They were actively destroying it, all under the guise of community improvement. The next day, Ethan decided enough was enough. He hired a land surveyor to clearly mark the boundaries of his property and reinforce that the contested area was legally his. The surveyor placed bright orange flags along the perimeter, and Ethan took photos of the work as further documentation. But Marcus's retaliation was swift. Within 48 hours, the flags had been torn down, and in their place, someone had spray-painted the words "community property" across his driveway in bold white letters. The sight made Ethan's stomach churn. It wasn't just vandalism. It was a psychological attack, an attempt to wear him down and make him feel helpless. Marcus, of course, was nowhere to be found, but his fingerprints were all over the incident. Ethan called a professional cleaning service to remove the graffiti and filed another report with the sheriff's office, though he wasn't optimistic about seeing any results. The tension reached a boiling point later that week when Ethan returned home to find a small crowd gathered on his property. Marcus was at the center, addressing the group as though he were leading a rally. He held up a clipboard, gesturing toward the newly cleaned driveway and the surveyor's markings. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Marcus declared, his voice dripping with indignation. "This land is a wasted resource. We could be using it to solve the parking issues we've been dealing with for years. Instead, it's being hoarded by someone who doesn't even care about the community." Ethan clenched his jaw and approached the group, his voice cutting through the chatter. "Get off my property, now!" The crowd turned to face him, some looking sheepish, others openly hostile. "Marcus, we're just trying to have a conversation. No need to be so aggressive. This isn't a conversation," Ethan shot back. "It's trespassing. Leave or I'll call the police." Marcus smirked. "Go ahead. I'm sure they'd love to hear about how uncooperative you've been with your neighbors. You might even get a visit from the planning board to discuss that rezoning request." The crowd began to disperse after a few tense moments, but not before Marcus delivered one last parting shot. "This isn't over, Ethan. You can't fight the whole neighborhood forever." Ethan stood his ground until the last person left, but the weight of Marcus's words lingered. He knew the fight was far from over and couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus still had more tricks up his sleeve. That night, Ethan sat at his desk, staring at the mountain of paperwork and evidence he had accumulated over the past weeks. He felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him, but he couldn't afford to stop now. Marcus was relentless, but so was Ethan's resolve. This wasn't just about his land anymore. It was about standing up to a bully who had pushed too far. No matter what Marcus threw at him next, Ethan was determined to push back harder. The culmination of weeks of tension came swiftly and explosively, far exceeding even Ethan's worst expectations. He had anticipated Marcus's next move to be another petty vandalism attempt or another bureaucratic ploy, but what happened instead was far more sinister. It began with a notice pinned to his front door one morning, an official-looking document that appeared to be from the county planning board. It stated that an emergency hearing had been scheduled to discuss the reallocation and rezoning of a portion of his land, based on a formal community petition. The date was set for 3 days from then. Ethan immediately called Laura, furious. "They're trying to rush this through before we can prepare," he said. Laura, always calm under pressure, reassured him. "This is a desperation move, Ethan. They're hoping you'll panic and fold. We'll show up armed with every piece of evidence we've gathered, and we'll expose this for what it is." Over the next few days, Ethan and Laura prepared meticulously. They compiled documents proving his ownership, photos of the damage, zoning laws that explicitly barred Marcus's attempts, and even statements from supportive neighbors like Harold. It was a mountain of evidence designed to dismantle Marcus's argument entirely. When the day of the hearing arrived, Ethan walked into the municipal building with his head held high. Marcus was already there, surrounded by a small group of his supporters. He greeted Ethan with a smug smile, but Ethan ignored him, taking his seat next to Laura. The hearing began, and Marcus wasted no time presenting his case. With his usual charm and manipulative flair, he painted himself as a champion of the community, claiming that the rezoning would solve long-standing parking issues and benefit everyone. He presented his fabricated petition and waved it theatrically in the air. "This is what the people want," he declared, his voice dripping with faux sincerity. "It's about time we work together for the greater good." Ethan's jaw tightened as he listened. He could see some members of the planning board nodding along, clearly swayed by Marcus's confident delivery. But then it was Laura's turn. Rising from her seat, she exuded authority as she laid out the facts with precision. "This case isn't about community improvement," she began. "It's about one man's repeated attempts to exploit and harass a property owner for personal gain." Laura methodically dismantled Marcus's arguments. She presented Ethan's property deed, zoning maps that confirmed the area was designated strictly for residential use, and the rejection letter from Marcus's previous application to turn another lot into a parking area. She pointed out the inconsistencies in Marcus's petition, including several forged signatures, which Harold had bravely come forward to identify. The room began to shift as the weight of the evidence became undeniable. Board members who had initially seemed sympathetic to Marcus now exchanged uneasy glances. But Laura wasn't done. She played a trump card that Ethan hadn't even been aware of. We've also submitted a formal complaint to law enforcement regarding acts of vandalism, trespassing, and intimidation that have occurred on Mr. Collins' property, she said. These incidents are directly tied to this so-called community initiative, and we have reason to believe Mr. Bennett has been orchestrating them. Marcus's smile faltered for the first time. He leaned over to whisper something to one of his supporters, but it was clear he was rattled. When Ethan took the stand to give his statement, he spoke plainly but firmly. This isn't about helping the community, he said. It's about control. Marcus Bennett has repeatedly violated my rights, damaged my property, and manipulated this neighborhood for his own purposes. I'm not here to disrupt the community. I'm here to protect what's mine. The hearing dragged on for hours, with Marcus desperately trying to salvage his case. But the more he spoke, the clearer it became that his arguments were flimsy and self-serving. By the end, the planning board's decision was unanimous. The rezoning request was denied, and Marcus was issued a formal warning to cease any further encroachments on Ethan's property. As the room cleared, Ethan caught Marcus's eye. The mask of confidence was gone, replaced by something darker. It wasn't over. That much was clear. But for the first time, Ethan felt like he had the upper hand. When he returned home that evening, he found a handwritten note in his mailbox. It read, "You think this is the end? Think again." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine, but he also felt a surge of resolve. Marcus could threaten and scheme all he wanted, but Ethan wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. In the days following the hearing, the neighborhood settled into an uneasy quiet. Marcus Bennett's defeat at the planning board had sent shockwaves through the community. For years, his manipulative charm and blustering confidence had allowed him to bully and intimidate others into submission. But now his influence was waning. Neighbors who once feared speaking out against him began to distance themselves. Ethan, however, remained on edge. He knew Marcus well enough by now to understand that losing publicly wouldn't stop him. It might even make him more dangerous. Ethan spent the next week securing his property. He reinforced the motion-activated floodlights, added more security cameras, and installed a reinforced gate at the entrance to his driveway. With Laura's help, he filed a civil suit against Marcus to recover damages for the destruction caused by the parking scheme and the attempted rezoning. Though it would take time for the case to move through the courts, Ethan knew it was a necessary step to hold Marcus accountable. Marcus, for his part, seemed to retreat into the shadows. His once frequent appearances at neighborhood gatherings and social events ceased entirely. The few times Ethan saw him, Marcus was driving quickly past in his truck, his eyes avoiding Ethan's. Yet the tension lingered, an unspoken threat hanging in the air. The breakthrough came when Harold, the elderly neighbor who had supported Ethan from the beginning, knocked on his door late one afternoon. Harold looked both cautious and excited as he handed Ethan a folded piece of paper. "You're not going to believe this," Harold said. "One of Marcus's old buddies let something slip the other day. Turns out, Marcus has been doing this kind of thing for years, but not just here. He's pulled similar stunts in other neighborhoods. I got a name and number for someone who might be able to help your case." The paper contained the contact information for a former associate of Marcus's who had once been a victim of his schemes. Ethan passed the information to Laura, and within days they uncovered a pattern of behavior that painted Marcus as a serial manipulator, using community improvement projects as a front to gain personal control over land and resources. This information strengthened Ethan's civil suit and opened the door to further legal consequences for Marcus. Meanwhile, word of Marcus's actions began to spread throughout the neighborhood. The community, once divided, started to rally around Ethan. Neighbors who had been hesitant to get involved now openly voiced their support, and several even offered to help restore the damage to his lawn. Harold organized a small gathering at his house, inviting Ethan and other residents to discuss ways to prevent someone like Marcus from ever gaining such influence again. As the lawsuit progressed, Marcus's hold on the neighborhood continued to unravel. He was forced to pay fines for his unauthorized parking lot and was ordered by the court to cover the cost of repairing Ethan's property. The once bold man who had declared himself the champion of the community was now a pariah, shunned by those he had once manipulated. Eventually, Marcus put his house up for sale and moved out of the neighborhood. His departure marked the end of a long and bitter conflict, and for the first time in months, Ethan felt a sense of peace. On a crisp autumn evening, Ethan hosted a small barbecue on his now restored lawn, inviting the neighbors who had supported him throughout the ordeal. The mood was light, filled with laughter and a shared sense of relief. As he stood by the grill, watching the children of the neighborhood play and the adults chat over drinks, Ethan felt a renewed sense of belonging. The battle for his land had been grueling, but it had also taught him something important. Standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem stacked against you, can inspire others to do the same. As the sun set over the hills and the sounds of the gathering filled the air, Ethan allowed himself a rare moment of contentment. His sanctuary had been hard-won, but it was finally his, and no one would take it from him again.